This video is sponsored by World Anvil. I've been making some videos about the new TTRPG Daggerheart from Darrington Press, because I think it's a pretty neat system. There's some stuff I love and some stuff I don't totally agree with, and it's been really fun and interesting to go through all these different aspects of the game, exploring different mechanics and design choices, and trying to figure out why those decisions were made. What were the design goals of Daggerheart, and does it succeed in those goals? But today we're not talking about any individual specific mechanic. Today we're kind of discussing a criteria for evaluating the game. See, this game was pitched to new players as a narrative-first game, and one of the more common criticisms I've seen of the game isn't even that the game is bad or that they don't like the mechanics, but that the game they're reading in the book or experiencing at the table or watching on an actual play show doesn't seem to line up with their expectations for what they consider to be a narrative-first game. And first things first, narrative first is a marketing term. It doesn't mean anything, it's vibes. Maybe when they sat down to create the game, they did write narrative first at the top of a big whiteboard and use it as their metric to figure out what mechanics they were going to use, or maybe it's a term they landed on when they were trying to figure out how to sell the game to a broader audience once it was finished. But narrative first isn't a concrete term in the TTRPG industry, like Vancian Magic or Dice Pool system. It doesn't have a specific definition. It's just a term they thought did a good job of summarizing the game. But I think it's really interesting that this specific term has caused at least a little bit of friction with the audience that's received the game. It's difficult for us to judge the game on its own merits if we're having a disconnect like this about literally just the way the creators describe and pitch the game to us. So that's what we're talking about today. Daggerheart is being sold to us as a narrative-first game. But what does that mean, and why are some people not agreeing with that definition? And I'm going to go through a few different ways you can define narrative-first games and see how Daggerheart compares to those definitions to try to see if we can figure out the way the designers are using it. Because I think that will help us better understand the game on its own terms, and that makes it easier for us to determine if it's accomplishing its design goals and whether it's the right fit for us at our tables. If you like this video and you want to see more of me, I'm going to be part of an upcoming live stream on September 26th raising money for the Trevor Project. We'll be playing through a fantasy cooking show in a game of 2014 D&D run by Tulok the Barbarian with some other fantastic players, so come join us on September 26th. More details to come. Keep an eye on my socials and my community tab for all the details, and come support a really fantastic charity. I'll definitely be talking more about this in my upcoming videos between now and the 26th. You're going to hear more about it, but it is going to be a blast, and I hope you join us for that. And now, on with the show. Now, the first definition of narrative first we're going to talk about today is one that I intend to dismiss pretty quickly because I just don't think it's a helpful definition. And I'm not sure all of the people using this argument are necessarily doing so in good faith. But I've seen people essentially try to dismiss Daggerheart as a game at all by arguing that narrative first doesn't mean anything because all tabletop role-playing games are narrative first. It's a redundant term in their eyes. And I think this is just such a strange argument, because it kind of implies that these people believe that the folks at Darrington Press are just taking the games we're all familiar with and finding a new term to describe all of them so they can slap it onto their own game and make it seem like they've come up with something clever, when really it's just marketing nonsense.
But everybody else's tobacco's toasted.
No, everybody else's tobacco is poisonous. Lucky Strikes is toasted.
Now, far be it from me to imply that some people might not always have the best faith arguments for why they're hoping something produced by Critical Role might crash and burn, because, in truth, maybe this argument is not being made exclusively by Critical Role haters. I think some of these people are, but others might genuinely think that most TTRPG games... That's redundant, the G stands for game. Anyway, they might just feel that all TTRPGs are, by definition, narrative first. And so whether or not they are a hater of Critical Role, when they hear this term, it just feels cynical to them. Like Darrington Press found a nonsense way to describe all games and they're using it to describe their own. But I think if that was the case, then I wouldn't have to make this video addressing the fact that some other people don't feel like this description actually applies to Daggerheart, and I'm trying to figure out why. There are many different ways we can define the term narrative first. Like I said, it depends on your own individual interpretation. That's what the rest of this video is about. You could absolutely make the argument that it's not as helpful a term as it could be, or that it's reductive because you could hypothetically use it to describe any TTRPG, but if you just assume that they meant nothing by it, that it's marketing gobbledygook, then not only is that a cynical perspective, which is not necessarily always wrong, but I think you're actually missing out on an opportunity for a genuinely interesting conversation about why this term isn't working for some people. Because the very fact that some people don't seem to think that Daggerheart feels narrative first to them means by definition those other critics don't think that term applies to every tabletop role-playing game. And so, here's my promise to you. By the end of this video, we are going to find the definition for this term, narrative first, that I think does apply to Daggerheart and also does not apply to every other TTRPG. We're giving the designers and their marketing team the benefit of the doubt to try to figure out what definition they're using. And by the end of this video, we will have an answer. You will, of course, be free to disagree with that conclusion. That's what the comments are for. So if at the end of this video you think everything I said was nonsense, you know, enjoy the comments. But that's our efforts today. Now, I think the most common argument, the next most common argument, and I think the most well-articulated argument, is that Daggerheart doesn't feel narrative first because it doesn't feel rules light. For these critics, it essentially feels like the term narrative first usually means mechanics second, and Daggerheart doesn't fit into that category for them. There are a lot of games where the mechanics are really simplified because the designers specifically want to get out of the way of the players having fun and telling a story together. Most Powered by the Apocalypse games are fairly rules light, and I do think Daggerheart often has fairly simple mechanics, which makes sense. It borrowed quite a lot of mechanics from a lot of rules light games, but I absolutely wouldn't describe Daggerheart as a simple game. It's certainly not less complex than any Powered by the Apocalypse game. The very fact that Daggerheart basically encourages you to use a lot of tokens or chips or meeples to keep track of your floating bonuses, or the fact that it's kind of accepted among the community that you almost definitely need an abacus to run the game so you can keep track of fear. This is not a game where the mechanics are secondary to the story you're telling at the table. The mechanics absolutely matter. This is not a rules-light game where the most important thing is the narrative because mechanics don't matter as much. Obviously, the designers hope that these mechanics will help you tell a compelling narrative. That's their goal. I think that's the goal of any mechanic in any role-playing game. But Daggerheart definitely has some mechanics that seem a bit crunchier than what I think most of us would expect to find in a rules-light game, especially the armor system. I just made a whole video breaking down that system. I'm really happy with that video, and I think the armor system does make sense and does a good job of trying to represent the world of the game, but it still has not a small amount of crunch to it. Now, crunchiness in TTRPGs is a spectrum. If you've really only played D&D, Daggerheart does feel a lot simpler than that system does. And compared to some of the other major TTRPGs taking off right now, like Draw Steel or Tales of the Valiant or Cosmere RPG, we might have individual different conclusions about which of them feel more crunchy. I don't know. I haven't tried any of those other systems yet, but, you know, sound off in the comments. Which one is crunchiest in your mind? Maybe some of you will feel it's Daggerheart because you do kind of need tokens to run it. But I would still say Daggerheart is at least crunchier than a lot of the other games it's borrowing mechanics from, because it's created by people who still, on some level, enjoy the complexity of D&D. So, if your definition of narrative first is rules light, maybe it's more rules light than some of the other games I just listed, but you still might not feel like Daggerheart passes the sniff test for a rules light system, and thus doesn't feel like it fits your definition of narrative first. Now, there are some games from the past, especially 20 years or so, that I wouldn't even say are rules light games. They are straight up storytelling games. And again, I'm sure there are some pedants out there that would argue that all TTRPGs are storytelling games, but when I'm talking about storytelling games, I'm talking about things like Fiasco or Dread or The Quiet Year. Games where you really are meant to feel almost removed from an attachment to your character accomplishing their goals and surviving and going on a bunch of adventures. The mechanics don't facilitate you being an awesome hero. You don't even really have the tools to accomplish any of your goals. The mechanics purely exist to push the story forward, very possibly at the expense of any of the player characters. Fiasco is basically a system designed to recreate Coen Brothers movies, which frequently feature characters dramatically failing to get what they want and often meeting violent and unglamorous endings. You don't sit down to play Fiasco unless you're ready for your character to potentially die in a gruesome and ignominious way. Dread is essentially a horror movie simulator where anytime you want to try something difficult, you have to pull a block from a Jenga tower. If you fail, your character is about to die. And you can knock over the tower if you want to sacrifice yourself to help your allies, but that's basically the only control you have over your fate. Your character doesn't have stats. You can't min-max your Dread character. And if you try to, by preparing in such a way where you have all the equipment in your inventory you could possibly need to survive any emergency situation, then you're not really engaging with the game on its own terms. And The Quiet Year literally doesn't have player characters. The whole purpose is to figure out the timeline for a fantasy setting and basically tell a sociological story about the various challenges a community might face. You can absolutely have important characters in your Quiet Year game, but your goal isn't to make them win, it's to play out their stories to their logical ends. Now, I will definitely say that Daggerheart has some great storytelling mechanics. We might end up talking about this another day. But a system like requiring the GM to spend fear is intended to kind of guide your session to a more dramatic conclusion than you might have otherwise if you just trust your instincts. You spend fear to make the game more dramatic for your players, but fear is also a resource you can run out of because you can throw too much at your players. And once you run out of fear, you've probably hit your players with a whole lot of stuff, and it might be time to take your foot off the gas and give the players a breather. And in fact, once you fill up with fear, even that is kind of an indicator the players have been rolling pretty poorly. It's a really interesting mechanic. The game has a bunch of advice about how to actually run the game. I'm really excited to get into all of that in some future videos. But every individual player is still in control of a singular character that has their own goals. Yes, in this hobby, we frequently talk about how it doesn't matter if you win or lose, something like D&D. The goal is to tell a compelling story together, and Daggerheart is definitely very much in that camp. But there are other games where that's explicitly what the mechanics are about, letting go of any control over your specific character getting everything they wanted, and instead just embracing the act of telling a compelling story together. It's the closest thing we have in this hobby to something like a group of writers working together to write an episode of a television or a screenplay. It's why so many of these games, like Dread and Fiasco, literally pitch themselves as replicating specific types of movies. And by the way, I know Call of Cthulhu is kind of in that camp as well, where you really kind of are prepared for the fact that your characters are going to suffer and die. I don't necessarily know if I would call it a storytelling game, but I'm not really sure why I draw that distinction, and because I haven't really played a lot of Call of Cthulhu, only a little bit, so maybe that's something we should talk about in the comments. Why does that feel different mechanically than these other storytelling games? That's an interesting discussion. But if this is your definition of narrative first, that the kinds of storytelling games we're describing and whether or not Call of Cthulhu fits into them, I think you would agree Daggerheart does not. However, I think I figured out what Daggerheart means when they call it a narrative-first game. They don't mean that it's narrative-first, your own personal character second, like you might get with one of those storytelling games. They obviously don't mean it's just a role-playing game, and they don't mean narrative-first mechanics second, like those rules-light games. I think what they mean is narrative-first rather than what Dungeons & Dragons is, which is Simulationist-First. I don't think D&D is really a narrative-first game. I think it's simulationist. Now, you can absolutely run D&D narrative first, but I would point out that the folks at Daggerheart are hoping their game is a better fit for that playstyle than D&D, and we'll talk about that in a second, but I think the goal of D&D is for your players not to feel like you're suspending the rules in favor of the story. The biggest points of discourse in this hobby that come up all the time are things like fudging dice rolls. Should you lie about your dice rolls to your players? Or rule of cool, where you ignore the rules to make cool things happen because they would just be badass. Or the quantum ogre, where people just have a lot of strong feelings, often negative, about the idea that the choices players make are artificial because they want to know that whatever was going to happen if they went down that hallway is actually what would have happened. They want to know that the ogre was always at the end of that hallway, and it wasn't just at the end of whatever hallway they went down. And whenever these topics of discussion come up, which is very frequently, even the people who defend these practices usually encourage you doing so in a way where your players don't catch on that you're bending the rules or changing the story for them. Rule of Cool is a little bit different. That's a little bit more about just a general play style where everyone at the table agrees that the strict application of rules is not as important as rewarding player creativity. But when it comes to dice fudging or the quantum ogre, the arguments behind both are that they make it a lot easier for you to cultivate a specific experience for your players, but also that you shouldn't let onto your players that you're doing that, because your players don't want to know when you're breaking the rules and not offering them a strict simulation of what would have happened. I think that's the heart of understanding Dungeons & Dragons, especially in contrast to a game like Daggerheart. This does not mean one is better than the other, but they have different goals, and the players have different expectations from them. Sure, these expectations might not be totally quantified yet for Daggerheart, since this game is so new and we haven't quite come to a consensus about how the game is played yet. This is a very new community around this game. But Daggerheart has mechanics that are specifically designed to teach your group how the game should be run, which is in a way that is a lot less simulationist than something like D&D. In Dungeons & Dragons, we expect the GM to have come up with all the details they present to us before the players interact with them. The GM knows what will happen when the players roll poorly before they call for a die roll. The GM knows what is in each room and all the details that they're going to describe for the players before you open the door. It is unusual in D&D for a GM to ask the players to describe what's in a room unless the players have invented that room because this is a room in their home that the party has returned to, or you gave the party a home base and they got to decide how they wanted to decorate it, or they've used the spell Mordenkainen's Magnificent Mansion to literally create the room themselves. Most of the time, the players aren't in control of what they see and hear. They look to the GM to determine those details unilaterally. Daggerheart takes a different approach, where it is a lot more reasonable to hand over some description details to the players. The game encourages the GM to introduce an important NPC and then ask the players what they look like and what other mannerisms they might have. Daggerheart has some mechanics that are meant to simulate the world of the game. I just made a whole video about their armor system, which is designed to do exactly that. But the game itself isn't simulationist. It prioritizes narrative. We even see this with D&D's random charts, especially something like the random encounters. When you roll a die on a chart to figure out whether the players will encounter a monster in the wilderness, you first roll to see if there is an encounter, and if there is, then you roll on a chart to find out what monster or situation they're going to be confronted with. Then you might be asked to roll to find out how many monsters there are. The goal is to represent the random nature of the world of D&D. We might sometimes fudge these results or come up with our own tables because we want these systems to produce more narratively satisfying results, but once again, we'll often hide that fact from our players, because the players want to believe everything we're coming up with is random. But random, I don't think, is the right word. Really, they want to trust that whatever happens at the game table is what would have happened. Your players encounter a manticore out there in the wilderness, but they're only level 1. How are they supposed to defeat a manticore? That's not fair. Well, when you're using this style of gameplay, the goal isn't really to be fair, it's to simulate a realistic world. Not a real world. Manticores don't exist, everyone at the table should know that. But the fact that a monster popped up in your path, especially a monster that very specifically has nothing to do with the quest you're currently on, makes the world of the game feel more real. In a recent session of my own D&D game, the players were on their way to find one of the magic shields they're searching for, but on their journey we rolled for a random encounter, and I got a couple of lycanthropes. So they had an encounter with a werewolf and a wereboar. And these monsters fit into something else I already put on the map. I know I can use them as an excuse to steer them towards another adventure location, but the point is this encounter has nothing to do with their quest they're currently on. In fact, because one of the player characters got bitten by the werewolf, it wound up distracting them from their current goal and sending them on a new quest to go find a werewolf cure. Now, sometimes as game masters, we'll fudge these results or change them because we want the results to be more dramatic or just challenging. I don't remember if I rolled on the chart and got lycanthropes or if I just got wolves. I like to think that the chart for level 6 to 10 players didn't just have a result that was just another handful of wolves, but let's be honest, it's a random encounter chart from D&D 5th edition. There was probably almost definitely a result that was just a bunch of wolves. But the goal was to make the players feel like this is what would have happened. And sometimes those moments can result in the perfect synchronization of random encounter and main story colliding together in perfect symmetry. In the second session of this campaign, the players were on their way to a logging site that had been recently abandoned due to supernatural forces. And on their way through the forest, they rolled for a random encounter, and the result was a woodcutter racing through the forest. It could not have been more perfect if I'd tried. It was tied into the plot, and I gave them an NPC who could give them a little bit more information about the dangers that awaited them, as he was currently fleeing those dangers himself. But it just happened because my wife rolled a 38 or whatever. It was just the randomness of the world. I think a lot of D&D players actually resent the idea that you're just going to invent story beats on the fly. For a lot of D&D players, they want to know that if something intense or dramatic or ominous or dangerous happens in your campaign, that's what would have happened. That's either something that you had pre-planned and always intended to occur, or it just happened due to the roll of the dice, in which case you weren't preparing it to screw over the heroes. The randomness of the world intervened and dropped that random encounter in front of the party. But in Daggerheart, that's not really how the game works. The game encourages you to invite the players to help describe important NPCs and locations to share the responsibilities of world building and narration with your players. The game even encourages you to build the world with your players, rather than just creating a world solo and presenting it to them. The game wants you to create the world with your players because it's valuable for a Daggerheart campaign to incorporate their backstories into the campaign and structure adventures around them, which is made more explicit by the fact that every player can literally add their customized locations to the world map during Session 0. I made a whole video about that a few weeks ago. So, where Daggerheart bills itself as a narrative-first game, I think it's defining itself in contrast to the simulationist nature of D&D. And if that doesn't sound like the way you play D&D, if your D&D games are full of narrative twists and everything is either connected to their backstories or into their current quest, or both, as was often the case in something like the Vox Machina campaign, well, if that's how your D&D games are run, then the folks at Darrington Press are really hoping you're interested in trying Daggerheart, because they think it would be a better fit for your playstyle. Now, whether you're running a narrative-first or simulationist-first game, whether the players are helping to shape the world from the very beginning, or you're building this world yourself and presenting it to your players and trying to make them feel like you've planned everything in advance, well, either way, you're going to need some way to help keep track of the details of your world. So, what should you do? Should you print out a whole binder of notes? No. I've tried that. And aside from the fact that it's a waste of paper and ink, it's also a huge pain in the ass to try to keep it behind your GM screen during the game. Should you put everything in your Google Docs? Well, that's a little better, but linking all those pages together would be a pain in the ass. Or you can keep them all in one document and then you just have to scroll for ages. That's not exactly something you can share with your players if they have any questions. You'd have to give them access to everything in your entire document. Should you just try to memorize all your world details and keep everything in your head? Pain in the ass. Write everything on Post-its and carry those with you to the game? Pain in the ass. Tattoo your world lore onto your flesh? Pain in the ass. No, instead you should use today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a fantastic online toolkit that you can use to create wiki-style articles for any aspect of your campaign setting. Monsters, magic items, factions, forgotten lore, gods, and so much more. I'm using World Anvil to keep track of the details for my own campaign setting right now, and World Anvil has been really invaluable. It gives me the tools I need to actually keep track of all the important stuff going on in my campaign. In my last session, the players got reminded about a whole bunch of unfinished quests they were still on the hook for, and factions that were still really angry with them. The whole session was basically about reminding them that the world still ticks on even when they move on from something and they've forgotten about it. And World Anvil is an incredible resource for being able to track the agents I've introduced for each faction, and I can use the timeline feature to figure out what these bad guys are going to do next. And I can keep that timeline hidden from my players, so even if they go to the timeline and they see everything else they've gotten up to, they won't see the timeline for the villain's plans. And I'm about to get a whole lot more use out of World Anvil because our bard has been feeling so much less powerful and so useless ever since, honestly, the second session. They were in the middle of making a plan in this last session to go send this genie to go capture a hag and bring it back to them. But as they were discussing doing that, instead, he commanded the genie to go get the most powerful weapon in the realm because he just really feels like he needs a better weapon. So now my 6th level party has the Sword of Cass. The bard is not even proficient in longswords, he can't use it, and I've already very clearly telegraphed that there's some other faction out there that will be very, very upset about this. So I'm about to pour a whole bunch of Vecna lore into my World Anvil page because this campaign is about to get very interesting. And if you want to use World Anvil for your own campaigns, I strongly recommend it. And World Anvil is offering a discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code supergeek at checkout, you can save 51% off of any annual membership. Once again, that's worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code supergeek. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. Thank you so much for watching, and also, real quick, I know things have been weird around here lately. I mean, I've been cursed by an algorithm wizard to make a whole bunch more videos than usual, but also a lot of YouTubers are experiencing a real dip. It seems like the algorithm is changing. Hey, Odwick.
What's up?
You know, all of these YouTubers are talking about the way the algorithm is changing, where it's like putting viewers in restricted mode without telling them and blocking some specific videos from being seen by people whose channels are flagged in restricted mode, so a bunch of channels aren't performing as well as they usually do.
Yeah?
Well, meanwhile, my channel's doing better than usual. I'm getting more views in the past month than I have been basically any other month this year.
Uh-huh.
So, is this related? Like, when you put a curse on me to make more videos, did you also tweak the algorithm to push all these other videos out of the cycle so my videos would do better?
Oh, not at all.
No?
No, that's a completely different thing. I'm just trying some stuff.
Oh. So is it just random?
Yep.
Oh. Okay. Well, that sucks.
Oh. Do people not like restricted mode?
No, they hate it.
Oh. Well, you can turn it off if you want. Just go into your YouTube account, click settings, then general, then turn off restricted mode.
Can you just not put people in restricted mode?
Oh, of course not.
Okay, could you tell us why a video gets restricted so we don't make those kinds of videos in the future?
Nah.
This system kind of sucks, Odwick.
Well, just keep making popular videos and it won't be a problem.
Odwick, it's not that easy to just make popular videos.
Sure it is. Just make a bunch of demystified videos.
Okay, just walked right into that one. Look, a bonus demystified video is coming later this week. All right?
Hooray!
Okay. Well, hopefully YouTube showed you this video and you enjoyed it. And yes, there is a bonus demystified video coming very soon, so keep your eyes out for that later this week. But while you wait, you should check out some of my other videos, like this one here where I talk about how Daggerheart handles armor and hit points. That was a fun video to make. Until next time, play fair and have fun.